Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Obvious Leadership Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Joey. We got Omar on the other side here. We want to kind of talk a little bit about this is something we were talking about before we got on, is identifying momentum and what to do with that, right? Like, where do you go? How do you control your emotions and not try to change a million things at that point when you see like, oh man, we're going in the right direction. You just keep wanting to, truck along and change too many things.
That
We want
shiny
to
new
talk.
toy.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, hey, what do you do at that point? And, a lot of times I feel like a lot of us, you can think about like a kid learning to walk, right? As soon as they take that 1 second step, you can just see them like wanting to bolt, right? They're wanting to start running. And sometimes it doesn't work out that well. And if they don't have the proper support, they fall, right? And
Yep.
sometimes that can have a retrograde effect, right? Maybe they don't want to stand back up and they're a little, scared to get back on their feet. But, sometimes when you try to go too fast, I feel like that's the effect that it happens. So it's like, you have to notice what's going on around you, take some of that in. And, I'm not saying to slow the momentum, keep with what you're going and, learn what's going on, actually understand what is making that effect. And I think that has more impact than just, continuing to truck along.
No, it does. And it kind of like that comment I just made, right? The shiny new toy. Like, here's the thing. Before you move to anything else, you want to continue that momentum that you're building and focus on it till it's a solid foundation. Because once you start, all right, this is working somewhat, let me just move to something else real fast, and let me move to something else real fast. It's you're trying to juggle plates, you're trying to juggle things on a paper foundation, and any small move is going to bring that whole thing tumbling down. Or that just, it's such a bad experience when that happens, that it really can derail you. And if your entire business is built off of that, it makes it even tougher to just get back up, right? Because where do I start? Where do I go? Because think of it reputation wise, with your current clients that you have, not even with future clients, with current clients that you're going through, the bad reputation that builds, that now you need to, smooth over. Because if you're thinking, well, I'll just get new clients. I mean, you could try that bad, that word of mouth is going to travel, and it's going to be bad word of the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, no, I think it's important, man. I think there's so much talk around, hey, look, change is inevitable, right? And you always have to keep moving forward. And while I definitely agree with a lot of those things, just like you said, you hit the nail on the head, man. Like, it needs to become part of your foundation, right? Whatever is making you successful and generating that momentum, identify it, learn from it, right? Retain it and make it part of your everyday process. And then when you take that next step, it's a new step, but you already have all that stuff that's right behind you. It's down, right? You have it, you have a process for all those things. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, and it's funny because so there's I don't know if I should call him a speaker. Let's call him a marketer. He calls himself a funnel hacker, Russell Brunson. Great guy. If you've never seen him, if you've never heard of him, I recommend you check him out. I actually use his products, and I read, I think at this point, most, if not all, his books that he's personally written. But for him in his business, whenever he helps coaching, his focus is don't do anything else differently until you make your first million with what you're doing. And he says it in a way so that you understand, like, hey, you need to become proficient. You need to build and continue the momentum on this before you can even go to another product, another offering, another service, or whatever, right? Get this down pat and then move to something different. And it's the same way when it comes to us, for instance, when it comes to me helping people coach their employees. You need to build a framework, a script essentially, that they're going to use continuously. Because once they have that, going back to my favorite quote, 60% of the time it works all the time, right? Anchorman. You have something that's going to work the majority of the time, And you're going to be able to realize, all right, I got this. It's a smooth transition. It's going to close. Or, all right, I'm losing it. I need to pivot, right? I'm going to close the majority of the ones that I'm going to close because I've already created a pathway of least resistance to that closing. And then the ones that I'm having, trouble with, I can start realizing what are the most common objections, or what's the most common point I lose those people, and then focus on the bigger chunk that you could actually do something with to help you elevate your close rate.
Yeah.
That's the gist of, what I help people understand. And that's where a lot of people lose things. You lose the momentum essentially because, well, I mean, it's kind of working. Let me just move to something else. And then you lose the momentum here and you have no momentum over there because you're essentially splitting your attention and your efforts. What do you do? Like, Joey, what do you do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, it's like, I'm thinking about the process that people want to implement a change, right? And I think what happens is that a lot of times it's not a simple one-step process, right? If we're trying to make some drastic change, right? And what happens is you put these step one, step two, you put timelines on it. This is where I want to be at this time. And you kind of force yourself to move forward, which, like we've talked about, sometimes is a good thing. But if you're leaving step one without having good footing and you're going to step two, you're most likely, you may not succeed at step two, right? Because you don't have a good foundation, right? And I think that, like, you have to make sure you have a plan, but you're also adjusting your plan based on what you're learning along the way, right? And so I feel like you always have to be adjusting your approach, right? And of course, you have step one, step two, step three, but honestly, like, you're going to have to sidestep sometimes to get to step number two, right? Make sure you're taking a long. That's how you're going to learn.
Yeah. And like we talked about it before, right? When you pivot, when you do something differently because you need to do something differently to get a change, it doesn't have to be a drastic change. And that's why I think some people believe that, like, oh, I got to bring change. I got to do something completely, 180 degrees difference. It's like, hold up. Change does not mean like that. Like, think about it. I want to say airplanes, right? If you've ever flown in an airplane and you look at the trajectory, if you look at the route that they're going and you see, like, oh, we're deviating, right? If you look at the angle that the deviation is occurring, it's typically a very small angle. It's the same thing when you're talking about like sailing. I don't need to talk about that because if you haven't seen One Piece, you guys are missing out. But like if you're on a boat, right? If you're sailing, same thing. If you're talking about like the difference in degrees, it may not look like a lot, but like a 3 degrees difference in where you're supposed to be going and where you're actually going is a huge difference, because as you go, that divide starts to grow. And it's like, oh, we're, 100 miles off course.
Yeah.
Right. That's the thing. And when we're talking pivoting, we're not talking like we're needing to make drastic changes. We're talking about a small change that you can do, right? When we're talking about, continuing your momentum and not losing that focus and that momentum, we're talking about the exact same thing, about being able to stay focused on course until that becomes a like second nature. You don't have to think about it consciously. You're able to do it. It's already in, your SOPs. It's a process in your organization so that you can now jump to that next item and be able to tackle that instead of trying to juggle everything at once and trying to do a complete 180 and then having your entire house of cards fall down.
Yeah. Well, it's coming to me a little bit. I remember a quote that I read. I think it's Eisenhower that said this. The plan is nothing. Planning is everything. Right. And what that's talking about, if you think about this from a military standpoint, a government standpoint, and things that require a lot of structure, right? The plan really is nothing. It's what you do along that journey to readjust and get you back on course, right? Where you need to go. because, you know, sometimes that plan may take you off course, but you also have to make sure that you realize that and put yourself back where you need to be, right? And sometimes that's part of the learning process, and maybe it'll get you there faster, who knows, right? But it's you always have to be a little flexible when it comes to your learning process.
You have to, because the moment things go wrong, and things are not going to go perfect, you can't account for all the variables. You guys know this from playing video games right now, how many bugs come out in AAA games, right? Nobody can account for things are going to be different. The exploits are going to happen, the, rebuttals, the obstacles, or even things that happen in the supply chain process. Like everything could have gone well during the whole sales process, but now you have hiccups during the supply chain process to actually get the procurement or the fulfillment for the client. But having the ability to plan through something allows you to have that. It comes back to a framework. It allows you the ability and the skills to build a framework where you're able to actually move forward, have the discussions, have conversations, because not all conversations are, even with your best clients, are going to be great conversations, right? Like
You're dealing with a living human being, right? Like you can't plan their response.
Exactly.
You know, and the other thing is like, you have so many emotions. Like I know I do these things with my eyebrows a lot. People may respond to it a different way. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
it's just one of those things. There's so many different aspects of what creates a reaction, and you can't plan for all of those things, right? And so,
exactly.
so you have to make sure that you are ready to adjust and, you know, to basically like counteract some of the things that may be holding you back, right? So it's just you got to be aware, and you have to, you know, I love when things go wrong, right? Because that is a learning process. That's a time for you to grow. That's a time for you to actually, oh, like this is what I didn't account for. Like this is awesome. This is a time for me to learn something that can go wrong and try to implement something to avoid it going forward. And that's kind of what I love about problems.
Yeah. And guys, we all know this. We're not going to run into those issues very often, right? Especially like the super hard ones. And understanding that having those frameworks in place, having the skills to not just understand, but also implement your own frameworks becomes a huge part for anybody, not just you as a leader, but also for the people on your teams to be able to work through different problems instead of them having to bring them back to you and bottleneck your time, your efforts to, solve the issues that they could do themselves. Right. And that's one of the important things. And that will help with your momentum as a leader in an organization because you're not being bogged down. You're not stumbling over everybody else's issues. And that's also another thing, too, that I think people misunderstand when it comes to being a leader is that you need to prioritize. Right. We talk about it in like a time management and also like a delegating form. But you also need to prioritize like what's important, what's not, what can hold off, what's an issue that you don't need to deal with because it can be solved at, a lower level, right? And it doesn't mean that you don't want to get involved, that you don't want to participate, that you don't care about your team. It just means that it's not that big of an issue to get you involved because you're driving initiatives elsewhere,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I mean, so one last thing before we cut off here, man. I remember going through a training, right?
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that they were talking about was that they're like, you talk about prioritization, right? And one of the things that they were saying were like, okay, let's talk about, you know, like some some metrics that we think might be more important than the other, and some things that need to be handled immediately. And so they're like, okay, well, you know, like responding to a boss's email, like, is that urgent, something that needs immediate attention, or is it, you know, something that can wait till later? And, you know, there were mixed reviews on it. But basically, you know, at the end of all these situations, you know, whether it's responding to a client or whether it's, you know, checking on this or responding to a text message or whatever it is, right? Depending on what you're doing, they were saying that basically nothing is a prioritization if you're on a schedule. And so while I kind of maybe agree with that, but I'm like, well, no, like there's some fires that need immediate attention, right? And you need to put a little bit of douse on that flame so that it doesn't overwhelm and blow up into something that's crazy, right? So
Mhm.
definitely, I think that there is an order of prioritization when it comes to certain things, but it's up to you to make sure that you are not prioritizing everybody else's problems versus the problems that you have that you need to address yourself, right? So there's definitely a delicate balance there. We talk about
Oh
it
yeah.
in our time. So we can talk a lot about that, and that we can make 10 episodes on time management alone, right? But
We always
you
talk
know,
about that.
maybe we need to do a little series or something like that. But anyways, I just wanted to kind of share that. People have this misunderstanding that nothing is a priority, right? But I think that in the same context, like some people say that, well, if you make everything a priority, then really nothing is a priority, right?
Yep.
So like I said, there needs to be a balance. It's important to talk about, but give things attention, that need to be done immediately.
Oh yeah. And guys, let us know what you think. What are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on how to prioritize, issues? How do you help, and continue your momentum that you're driving? Right. I'm
Yeah.
sure you guys have some thoughts on your own on this, and we'd love to hear it. So be sure to drop a comment, send us a message, send us an email, let us know, right? Find us on our socials, TikTok, LinkedIn. We're there, we're active, get involved.
Yeah.
So but as always, guys, we want to thank you for stopping by, checking out another episode of the Leadership Podcast. I'm
Yeah.
Omar.
I'm Joey. Y'all have a great night.
All right, guys, we'll catch you on the next one.
Later.
And that brings us to the end of today's Obvious Leadership episode. Remember, every great leader starts with one step, and you're already on your way. Small changes lead to significant impact. Until next time, keep leading with purpose, and remember that leadership is the key to unlocking extraordinary results.